Welcome to the InterAgency Board podcast. The InterAgency Board can be found at interagencyboard.org. Everybody, back to the podcast. I'm your host, Dave Donahue. Today we have three guests with us. Don Hewitt. Don is a retired IT and cybersecurity consultant who has maintained his role as a subject matter expert for the IAB and is currently the president of the IAB Foundation. Nearly 25 years ago, he began a project called the Responder Knowledge Base. As part of that project, he devised the numbering scheme and structure used by the IAB standardized equipment list. That structure was adopted by FEMA's authorized equipment list in 2004. And since that time, Don has remained the principal editor of the SCL and by association, the AEL. He is also a private pilot with multi-engine and instrument ratings. Ed Baylor served with the United States Capitol Police for over 35 years. During his career, Ed worked on and developed many state-of-the-art protective and response programs and handled thousands of events from demonstrations to inaugurations. Over his career, he served multiple roles, including Field Forces Commander of the Civil Disturbance Unit, Mercy Coordinator for the U.S. Capitol buildings, overseeing continuity and continence of the legislative branch, Commander of the U.S. Capitol Police Protective Intelligence Division, Special Investigations Division, Special Events Sections, Patrol Mobile Response Division, First Responder Unit, and Threats Assessment Sections. Watch Commander of the Operations Division. He developed the U.S. Capitol Police's CBRNE program and served as the commander of the WMD Advanced Law Enforcement Response Team, which was one of the first law enforcement hazmat responder teams in the country. He also served as special assistant to the chairman of the U.S. Capitol Police Board. Doug Wolf is the deputy chair and one of the earliest members of the Interagency Board, dating back to 1998. Working with the Department of Justice and Defense, he was involved in the original development of the standardized equipment list. In addition, Doug served 32 years in the fire service, where he managed special operations programs. Welcome, gentlemen.
Morning.
Morning.
Can you start by telling us what the IAB is and what it does?
Doug, you're the guy with the shirt on.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, he's got the background.
Well,
Good
and I might
morning.
add that you can wear that shirt because you're in Florida. Up here, we are wearing sweaters.
Man, it snowed here while I was in Wyoming. But anyway, good morning. My name is Doug Wolf. And yeah, the IAB started back in the 1998 timeframe, right after the original Nunn-Lugar bill came out, which provided grant funding to states and locals to support the potential response to a CBRNE event. At that time, they were also fielding what was then called RAID teams. We know them now as CST teams. And the Department of Defense wanted to know what equipment would be important to these now civil support teams so that they could be interoperable with local responders. I mean, the personal protective equipment the military is used to is typically MOP4 gear for chemical protective clothing, which is very ineffective against many toxic industrial chemicals. And they wanted to be able to be more interoperable with the local community should they be dispersed. So the DoD or Department of Defense needed a list. They need a list of equipment, and apparently, as Don puts it on a bar napkin someplace, an idea of putting together an interoperable group or a group to help provide that data to DoD and to the Department of Justice as well became a necessity. So we originally started meeting in the 1998 timeframe in the bowels of the Pentagon with representatives of Department of Justice, FBI's DNDO group, and the Department of Defense to develop this list. Well, at the same time, FEMA had been charged with the need to provide grant funding to states and locals for equipment under the Nunn-Lugar bill. And FEMA needed a list. Well, we were developing this list for the Department of Defense, and FEMA saw that, and they picked it up and converted that list into what most responder organizations now know as the authorized equipment list. And to this day, the Interagency Board manages much of that list and makes recommendations to FEMA for additions or deletions of items off the authorized equipment list. And we provide more detail for each line item that we show in the standardized equipment list concerning things such as operating considerations, selection and use criteria, training needs, standard applicabilities or applicability of existing standards and so forth to each of the items that we list, which Don, you could clarify, I think are around 800 and some odd items on the list and still growing.
Yeah. Just about 800.
So
And it's interesting,
yeah.
when you said to this day, I thought what you were going to say is to this day, half of the people out there don't know the difference between the SCL and the AEL.
Yeah.
And, you know, in short form, the standardized equipment list is what the IAB and feet on the street responders are recommending to everybody out there for mass casualty events. Those are our generic recommendations, not specific products, but generic recommendations on how, you know, what do you need? The authorized equipment list is what FEMA is willing to pay for with the grant programs, and they're not always the same thing. The quickest example is, you know, we have on the SEL, we recommend that you have notebook computers. Well, if garden variety notebook computers were paid for by grant money, half the grant money would go to Dell. So the FEMA guys are saying, no, we're not going to do generic notebooks, even though we know they're relevant. We're not going to put those on the grant programs. So there are these subtle differences. The lists are about 80%, 85% congruent. But we continue to provide technical information that feeds both lists.
But and to add to that, originally our mission was the CBRNE event. You know, it was the standardized or the Interagency Board for Equipment Standardization and Interoperability. But after the Katrina incident of 2005, we went more to an all hazards approach. So we list mission-specific sublists for numerous different missions that the responder community could engage in.
And how you mentioned the SEL? How does the process of equipment assessment work for the SEL? How does that process? How does it originate and how does it flow?
Yeah, you know, as I say, it's not a list of individual products, but rather a generic list. So, for example, for SCBAs, we're not listing Scott. We're just saying, hey, a CBRN capable SCBA. So what happens is we get suggestions. Sometimes the suggestions actually come from FEMA to us. Often they come from within the IAB, and someone will say, hey, here's this new technology, here's this new kind of product, and we think it's important for people to have those or look at those as part of a mass casualty response. So that then goes into the appropriate subgroup in the IAB, and the subgroup will come up, they'll formulate, first of all, they'll either approve or disapprove, but then they'll formulate what they want that item to look like. And it generally comes to me to be edited, and then we add it and put it up on the website. When we do, there's an automatic generation of a form to FEMA that says, hey, the IAB thinks this thing is very relevant for you know, mass casualty response. Why don't you see if you want to pick it up on the AEL as well? And then, you know, it either does or doesn't get picked up by FEMA.
And who exactly is the IAB? What are the requirements to be a member of the IAB? Who do they represent?
Doug, your membership and Ed is experienced, so let me push that to you guys.
I would just like to say, talk about experience, Don, is that the IAB was kind of formed up by the government who was scared. And the government in like 95-ish, a lot of things was happening in the world. You know, we had the sarin gas attack in Tokyo. We had the Branch Davidians in Waco. And after that, they blew up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City.
Yeah.
So our government and FEMA and all of the people to protect our government was a little scared. So they started putting together a bunch of experts, the best of the best in our country, to meet and to figure out, actually when they started to figure out what the government could do for the future to stop these things. And so when they put all these basically responder chiefs, most of them fire chiefs, they said, heck, we don't want to know what's happening in the future. We want to know what's happening now. And so that was kind of the start of the IAB. That's how I got involved. They had all these fire guys together, and one of the things they said was, "Hey, we have no policemen. Who are we going to get to be a policeman?" And at that point, we just come out of the secret side of CBRNE, and they asked me to start going to meetings. And then as the IAB developed, it became all hazards, like Doug said. And now we went from, Katrina forced us into swiftwater rescue, and those type of things, which opens up all new equipment that the country needs. And that's basically where we came from and how I got involved. Actually a guy named Jim Schwartz was the chief in Arlington County.
Yeah.
This board that was set up unofficially came out and saw what we were doing, and he said, "Oh, we got to have this guy." And so he said, "Would I want to join up this team?" And I said, "Okay, I'll see what it's like. I got to go run it. You always got to run it past the boss." And so,
Ed,
and a group. I'm sorry.
Yeah, let me. You touched as you went by. You touched on something I think is really fundamental about the IAB. And we tell the story over and over again about the cops and the firefighters sitting down on a bar napkin and starting to sketch out what equipment. Well, in the 1998 timeframe, cops and firefighters didn't generally go to the same bars. I mean, before 9/11, before all this, the idea that the police and fire would be, cooperating with that intensity, that didn't happen much. And it became, I think, one of the most important features of the IAB. And that is the IAB has fire, police, EMS, some standards, emergency management, all these disciplines. And I don't know, Doug, you may correct me, but I still don't know of any other group that is that multidisciplinary and independent and trying to represent the interests of all emergency responders.
Yeah,
and to me, that's the key.
The organizations from the federal government that were involved with us at our peak. I mean, we had probably 6 or 7 different offices of Department of Homeland Security. We had Department of Justice involved. We had DOD involved. We had all of these stakeholders, CDC, NIOSH, and that was one of the success. At our peak, we were at about 150 members, of which 70% were emergency responders: fire, law enforcement, EMS, emergency management, public health. Those agencies were there, and about 30% were federal government partners that could help us push things forward. And I think one of the best examples of a success was early on in our discussions back in the late 90s, early 2000s, was, will our self-contained breathing apparatus that we rely on so heavily protect us from a Tokyo sarin type event? Are they capable of that protection in those types of scenarios? And I think it took about 18 months to come up with draft standards, testing methodology, and the first certified SCBA to come off the shelf and be approved as CBRN certified. Now, if you know the federal government, nothing happens in 18 months. And those were some of the successes that we saw. And then we started, oh gosh, we'd go to the IAB, would meet at different places, and we go into trade shows where they're selling stuff, and we would see some real snake oil out there. And the ability to get people like FEMA to agree to the concept that if you're going to pay grant money, if you're going to give grant money for something, if there's a piece of personal protective equipment, for example, that has a standard, a nationally established standard for it, that grant money can only be used for equipment that meet those standards. And that prevented a lot of snake oil from being sold using grant money. So a lot of successes.
And what is the status of the IAB today? You mentioned it. Was it a peak? Where's it at today, and where's it going?
You know, one of the things about organizations that are either grant funded or otherwise government funded that are independent is they get that money, they get that sponsorship because they have champions somewhere in the government structure, whether that's a high-ranking officer in DOD or high-ranking civilian for that matter in DOD, or Congress. Somewhere somebody says, hey, that's a good thing, and I'm going to make sure some money gets there. We had, as Doug was saying, there was a time when there were like 150 members of this thing, and we had multiple champions in different parts of the government. I'm a living example. People get old and they retire. You too, Baylor. But seriously, we lost critical champions. And when the budget crunch, and the other thing is, in the immediate wake of 9/11, the emergency was clear, the crisis was clear. People, the grant programs ballooned, and then it settled down. And as it settled down and some of our key champions retired, the budget crunch began. And at that point, we didn't have somebody who was able to pound the table and say, no, that money's got to stay there for these guys. And so eventually all our federal funding dried up. And that was when we started the IAB Foundation and started trying to fund ourselves to keep the group alive. And it's life in the big city, right? The funding is not guaranteed to last forever, and you got to make your own way at some point. So that's where we are now. We're operating on a fraction of the original budget that we had. We don't have a lot of paid administrative support. These are dedicated men and women who believe that an organization like the IAB is necessary to support the response community, and they're willing to sacrifice to keep it alive.
And it's fully volunteer.
Yes.
Nobody's being compensated we aren't getting paid to fly all over the country to meet. Much of it's on our own dime or on a very limited budget that's contributed by private sector or wherever by drug seizure money, wherever we can scarf together a little bit of money to cover the travel costs of those who can't afford to come on their own. But it's fully volunteer. And it always has been.
Which is critical to establishing and maintaining the credibility of the group when we start talking about what technologies are good and which technologies we think are snake oil.
Two interrelated things. How can people who are listening to this support the IAB, and how can they get in contact with the IAB?
InterAgencyBoard.org will take you to the webpage, and all the contact information is there. For those willing to contribute to the IAB, that's handled by the foundation, which is a 501c3 organization. And we've opened up, I'll let Don talk to that more, but we've opened up without federal funding. We are looking at manufacturers and so forth, or philanthropy groups that are willing to donate to keep this mission moving.
As you can imagine, from the foundation standpoint, it's a delicate dance because, we'd like to be able to accept more, money from vendors, for example. But our objectivity and our reputation are way more important than any given contribution. So we got to be really careful to be at arm's length from anybody who's actually manufacturing equipment that might show up in one of the SEL categories. It does it creates, just makes it more difficult, to go out there to companies and say, hey, give me money. But we've gotten, go ahead.
Yeah, we do have some manufacturer representatives on the IAB, but they are well aware that we are not going to allow them to identify selection criteria or operating considerations that strictly benefits their product line, and they're well aware of it. But the ones that we've got are truly subject matter experts in the standards and what needs to be out there to protect individuals.
And they wind up, most of them are already on standards committees like at ASTM or NFPA, which is critical for us because that gives us lines of communication with some of the standards development organizations.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know before we sign off for today?
I think one of the key parts of the IAB today and our low volume of people because of funding is that we still matter in the fact that when we get together and we come up with a proposal or an idea that there's a threat to responders, we will get together and investigate, research, testing, everything that might be needed to fix it. Just from my standpoint, we're going through now police responding to wildland fires. And what we do, we will write a white paper to people in the government who will listen to us because of our accreditation and who we are as experts in the field. And so it may go there to help these wildland fire responses in this standpoint, by policemen going out, stopping traffic with embers going flying by so that they don't burn up. And so we're working on that now. It's almost ready to be printed and sent out to FEMA and the people that will listen for equipment. And so the police need some type of fire retardancy to protect them when they're doing like the Palisades fire out in California. So these white papers that we produce now is a good thing. People listen. One of the bad things we have is the IAB. For years, we were able to go to shows, and Doug talked about it a little earlier. We were able to go to shows and pick out the snake oil equipment and say that equipment should not be funded because it's a danger to responders. It's a danger to firemen. Whatever piece of equipment, when you go to a fire show, a police show, an EMS show, that now we're stuck because of lack of funding. We have lost that mission, so to speak. And I guess to kind of wrap up, I don't know. I'm kind of I'm one of the old guys on the IAB, and
Two.
It is
Three.
I know. And so we started out a long time ago, and we developed a lot of camaraderie. And if you just think of the history and the people that was on the IAB, I am just in my career, and I'm sure in Don and Doug's career, to just be associated with the group of people that put this thing together and keeps it running. I'm just proud to be just a member, let alone associated with that group of individuals. And if you look at the history with, say Jim Schwartz was the incident commander for the plane crashing into the Pentagon. How top can you get that? And the World Trade Center bombing and Bobby Ingram and the guys that were part of the team.
Yeah.
That did great for America. And it's our mission. We're a bunch of guys get together, a bunch of responders get together to make things better for other responders. And one of the last things I wanted to say is, I think we never really talked about it too much, is we do a lot with communication. And Doug, you know that whenever there's a major event and the shit hits the fan, that communication's always the problem. We have some good people that knows the top of the line technologies, and we're moving on that. So other than that,
one thing I'd like to add to what Ed said, going out and looking at snake oil, looking for snake oil is one thing. But the other thing is we identify people will come to us with, in fact, one of the early days of the IAB, we met with manufacturers, and manufacturers were saying, hey, we're thinking about developing this product. What do you think? They would get feedback from us as to how they should move forward with that, and would it or would it not be helpful to the responder community. But when we found those things that really needed some help, we would get with the standards development organizations like NFPA and ASTM and the NIOSH, National Personal Protective Technology Laboratory, and so forth. And we would advocate for standards developments to make sure that as these things were being produced, they were being produced to a high enough quality standard that they actually met. And we had a lot of successes from that. And before we close, I also want to add two names to the party here. Colonel Adrian Bogart from Department of Defense. At that point, when he was involved with us, it was Major Adrian Bogart with the DOD's Consequence Management Office, and A.D. Vickery from Seattle Fire Department. They were probably two, and John Franks from the FBI's Domestic Preparedness Office. They were the three real people who pushed this thing forward to get it started, and a lot of credit goes to them.
Hey, Doug, don't leave out Charlie Bell either from Marine Corps and Consequence Management.
Yeah.
But yeah, boy, those are just luminaries.
Right.
And we've been, just standing on the shoulders of giants. Those guys are. It's hard to describe how important they were, both to their own organizations and to the responder community as a whole. I don't know. I can't add much except to reiterate that www.iab or interagencyboard.org. And there is a /foundation will get you to the foundation page. The literature we put out about the foundation has a big headline on the front side that says, who protects the protectors? And I guess my closing comment would be, there isn't any other organization out there like the IAB. And the IAB needs to be there to promote the safety and effectiveness of all responders, fire, EMS, police, and we need help keeping it there, but we are committed to be there.
One last thing that Don just knocked a few brain cells together for me, but one of the biggest things that the IAB can do for a responder out there, if they're experiencing a problem, and it's not a problem, it's the next problem, because there's going to be problems, is that the IAB is made up of some pretty good, very well connected responders. And if some responder out there is having a problem with equipment, with a standard, with the training program, if they're having a problem, they should call the IAB or get a hold of the IAB, and we'll try to give them some good guidance. And if we can't get it, we have unbelievable reach back to some great responders who may have done that in the past, and we'll help them out. So,
it shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody that there is an email address, info@interagencyboard.org. And if you've got a question, if you want to volunteer, anything, shoot something to that email address. Someone will get back to you.
All right, gentlemen, thank you for your time. And again, if you want more information, you can go to the interagencyboard.org or contact them at info@interagencyboard.org. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You have been listening to the InterAgency Board podcast. Views expressed are those of our guests and may not reflect the position of the InterAgency Board. For more information on the InterAgency Board or to access publications, including the Hazardous Materials Hotline and white papers, or to access the standardized equipment list, visit interagencyboard.org. For questions, comments, or to leave a message, email info@interagencyboard.org. Again, that address is info@interagencyboard.org.